Chapter 781. Yan Ming's brows furrowed slightly. It seems that he was unable to unleash his soul skill as he doesn't have sufficient soul power to support it. I'll give you a hand this time. Try that again. He appeared behind Tang Wulin in a flash as he spoke, and he transferred his right hand from Tang Wulin's shoulder to the middle of his upper back. Tang Wulin immediately sensed a burst of extremely gentle yet dense soul power being injected into his body, quickly replenishing his meridians, which had already run dry. This was the mysterious heaven method in its purest form. Tang Wulin looked up at the stunned expression on his face. He was quite surprised that the pavilion master had also cultivated the mysterious heaven method. Concentrate and focus your attention, then try and unleash your new soul skill again. Yan Ming had an enormous wealth of soul power, and he'd also cultivated the mysterious heaven method, so it was a simple matter for him to emulate Tang Wulin's soul power. Tang Wulin hurriedly circulated his newfound soul power, injecting it into his fifth soul ring. Greenish golden light erupted once again, and the soul ring absorbed the soul power within his body at an alarming rate. Only then did he truly experience just how fearsomely powerful the limit Douluo was. He could feel soul power pouring relentlessly into his body through his back, and it was as if he were being supported by an inexhaustible ocean of power. Despite the dramatic rate at which the greenish golden soul ring was sapping his soul power, it was no match for the rate at which the soul power within his body was being replenished. The greenish golden soul ring began to glow brighter and brighter, and Tang Wulin could feel as if something had blossomed within his mind. When he focused his attention internally, he discovered that his mind had also turned a greenish golden color. He raised his head slightly, and a green insignia of light that resembled a new seedling suddenly appeared on his forehead. Immediately thereafter, a greenish golden halo of light erupted from Tang Wulin's forehead. The halo radiated outward in all directions, stretching to around 10 meters in diameter before slowly falling to the ground. All of the titled Douluos reflexively backed away so they could get a better look at the mystifying sequence of events that was currently unfolding. After the greenish golden halo of light descended onto the ground, it formed a green ring of light. Within the ring of light, a series of strange greenish golden rings emerged, but they were hovering in midair as opposed to appearing on the ground. Extremely rich life force energy proliferated through the air with the greenish golden ring of light at the very epicenter. But on this occasion, the life force energy belonged solely to the plant world and couldn't be absorbed by humans. Tang Wulin reflexively spread open his arms, and the green wheel of light that had appeared once already emerged behind him once again. The greenish golden figure that bore a strong resemblance to him also reappeared, and with massive greenish golden vines surged forth in a frenzy with that greenish golden figure at the very center. There were a total of 12 vines, each of which was as thick as a water tank, and they descended from up above before plunging directly into the ground. All of a sudden, the earth turned into a greenish golden color, and the same color began to spread through the surrounding area. All of the plants encompassed within this scope quickly took on a golden hue, and what was even more remarkable was that all of these golden plants began to sway gently while emitting extremely powerful energy fluctuations. At this moment, Tang Wulin had already been completely immersed in his own spiritual world. He felt as if he could sense the entirety of the sea god's island. His sensory scope then continued to proliferate over the sea god's lake, and in the next instant, it had encompassed the entire intersection of Shrek City. All of the plants in that area also turned into a golden color. They were like Tang Wulin's eyes and arms, and as long as these plants were within the area encompassed by his consciousness, he could make them do whatever he wanted as if they were parts of his own body. What was even more astonishing was that he was struck by the feeling that he could teleport himself to any area within his sensory scope through these plants. An indescribable sense of power welled up in his body. Every single plant was offering their energy to him without any reservation, and as long as his body could handle it, more and more energy would accumulate within him. Furthermore, all of these plants were absorbing the natural energies in the surrounding air in a frenzy, converting the natural energies into life force energy to nurture themselves, as well as to reciprocate Tang Wulin. All of a sudden, just as he was experiencing this extraordinary phenomenon, he abruptly blacked out and his consciousness completely faded. When he woke up again, it had already turned dark outside. Tang Wulin was struck by a piercing headache that felt as if something were tearing open his skull from the inside, and the intense agony made him moan involuntarily. Are you awake? A gentle voice sounded from beside him. Tang Wulin reflexively turned toward the direction that the voice had come from, and his vision was slightly blurry, but he could still discern that Atlas Douluo Yan Ming was standing beside him. Pavilion Master. Tang Wulin tried to struggle into a seated position, but he was unable to muster up even a shred of strength. It wasn't that he had no strength in his body. Instead, his spiritual power was severely depleted that he was struggling to control his own body. Keep lying still. Don't try to get up. This was an oversight on my part. Yan Ming made his way over to Tang Wulin before pressing a golden bead against his forehead. A cool and refreshing sensation spread through Tang Wulin's glabella, and his headache was immediately significantly alleviated. Yan Ming continued, you may have created history and attained a truly extraordinary soul skill. Huh? Tang Wulin looked up at Yan Ming with a surprised expression. His vision was finally becoming clearer as his spiritual power was replenished. Yan Ming explained, if I'm not mistaken, your fifth soul skill should have been formed by a combination of the blue silver emperor and the golden tree. It's hard to say what kind of form this soul skill exists as and what level its corresponding soul ring is, but what I can tell you is that this soul skill is a domain that can span an extremely massive area. At least, among all of the soul skills I know of, your one encompasses the largest area. I can make some deductions from the observations that I obtained while you were unleashing that soul skill, but you'll have to fill me in on some details. At the time, I could sense that all of the plants encompassed by the scope of your soul skill had turned golden in color. These golden plants naturally absorb the natural energies and all types of elements from the air, which results in an effect that's even more potent than elemental stripping. All elemental soul masters will be severely handicapped within your domain. Of course, the prerequisite for this is that there must be a sufficient amount of plant life in the area. On top of that, your soul power was reciprocated by the soul skill, thereby resulting in a drastic spike in your soul power. At its peak, your soul power had spiked to close to rank 80, which means that the amount of soul power in your body was enhanced by more than tenfold. An increase in soul power from rank 50 to rank 80 isn't just an increase of around 70%. The higher the rank, the greater the increase in soul power. So a tenfold enhancement is only a conservative estimate. We weren't able to sense anything else after that as we discovered that not only does this soul skill need to be fueled by an extremely vast amount of soul power, it's also just as taxing on your spiritual power. You were able to maintain the soul skill for a total duration of 13 seconds, even though you possess close to 8,000 points of spiritual power, which indicates a staggering amount of spiritual power expenditure. All in all, we're far from ascertaining the complete scope of this soul skill's abilities. Is there anything you'd like to add? Tang Wulin contemplated this question momentarily before replying. At the time, I could only feel that my entire spiritual world had turned a greenish golden color, just like the color of my soul ring. After that, I felt like my consciousness could cover an extremely vast area, and all of the plants in that area had become my eyes, allowing me to teleport to any area I wanted where these plants existed. I could even control them to do whatever I wanted. I also sensed the energy reciprocation that you were talking about. It felt like more and more life force energy would pour into my body to be converted into soul power as long as my body could handle it. Chapter 782. Teleportation and plant control. Good. Those are two more facets of this soul skill's abilities. Yan Ming nodded to himself in a contemplative manner as he mused, which means that if you can fully control this soul skill, you'll have attained teleportation abilities within a set area, the ability to control all plants within that area, and a significant temporary boost in your soul power. Is that correct? Tang Wulin replied, that seems to be the case. However, I can't really control the soul skill. I could only sense this much before I completely blacked out. Yan Ming nodded and said, it's already quite remarkable that you were able to sense this much. From now on, don't even think about using this soul skill until you attain your 8th soul ring and get your spiritual power up to the spirit domain realm. Tang Wulin faltered upon hearing this. So you're saying I won't be able to unleash this soul skill unless I possess the soul power of a soul Douluo? Yan Ming replied, that's right. At least, that's my assessment from the amount of soul power that I had to inject into your body at the time. It's good that you cultivated the mysterious heaven method. If you want to forcibly unleash this soul skill, you'll only be able to do so with other people who've also cultivated the mysterious heaven method injecting their soul power into your body. However, most people can't control their soul power output to the extent that only pure soul power without any attributes from their martial souls is transmitted. Hence, don't attempt this unless you absolutely have to. Otherwise, the attributes from the martial souls of others will affect you, and that could even cause deviations in your cultivation. Of course, Yang Ning was an exception to this. With his immense power and control, it was naturally a simple task to ensure the output of soul power in its purest form, but that didn't apply to most other people. Tang Wuling gulped upon hearing this. Spirit domain realm spiritual power, that still seemed to be very far away from him. On top of that, who knew how long it would take until he became an 8-ring soul Douluo? Unfortunately, this soul skill clearly couldn't be fueled using his blood essence power. As such, as opposed to becoming excited by the fact that he'd obtained such a powerful soul skill, Tang Wuling was feeling rather dejected. Regardless of how good this soul skill was, there was no point in its existence if he couldn't use it. If he had to wait until becoming a soul Douluo to use this 5th soul skill, then it wouldn't be able to enhance his power in any way in the immediate future, which made it a rather useless skill for now. Furthermore, even if he were to use it in the future, he'd have to get his spiritual power up to the spirit domain realm first, and that was certainly not going to be a simple task. The spirit abyss realm was already the upper limit for the vast majority of soul masters, and even though the spirit domain realm was only the next realm above the spirit abyss realm, there was a massive gulf between the two of them. Tang Wuling's spiritual power was only able to reach the spirit abyss realm as he'd been blessed by the residual will of countless true dragons after burying their skeletons in their dragon valley. But that was an extremely rare opportunity. As such, if he couldn't use this soul skill before his spiritual power reached the spirit domain realm, then it was like a powerful tool that he could only see yet not use. How could he not be frustrated by this? However, Yang Ning clearly wasn't of the same opinion. He had thought about many things during Tang Wuling's period of unconsciousness, and his eyes were glowing as he said, if you want to be able to make use of this soul skill, I think you should focus more of your attention on enhancing your spiritual power than improving your soul power. There are only a limited number of ways through which spiritual power can be cultivated. You're currently cultivating the purple demon eyes, which will assist you in that regard, but the cultivation of the purple demon eyes is something that can't be rushed. As such, I'll try to find some cultivation methods for you that are specifically designed to improve one's spiritual power. Thank you. At this moment, Yang Ning's expression suddenly darkened. However, you must be held accountable for stripping the golden tree of 30% of its power. Following a meeting between myself and the elders of the Sea Gods Pavilion, we've already decided on your punishment. A punishment? Tang Wuling's heart jolted upon hearing this. What was it going to be? Whatever it was, he was willing to accept it as long as it didn't affect his cultivation. Yang Ning continued, you're going to have to leave the academy for a period of time to train in the outside world. This doesn't just apply to you, but also to all of the other members of Shrek's 7 monsters. All of you are young and extremely talented, so what you need now is to accrue practical experience through hardships. You'll all be sent to the Federal Army, where you'll be undergoing the most rigorous training. Only after you obtain the approval of the army will you be allowed to return. Military training is punishment. A peculiar look appeared in Tang Wuling's eyes. How could the army provide rigorous training for them? They were among the best disciples Shrek Academy had to offer, and they were all one-word battle armor masters. In the outside world, they would be considered to be very powerful soul masters already. How was military training supposed to be difficult for them in any way? Tang Wuling was rather confused. However, the smile on Yang Ning's face struck him with a sense of foreboding. The smile was rather peculiar to behold, and Tang Wuling couldn't help but feel that it seemed to be a rather cruel smile, as if Yang Ning were deriving some kind of gloating pleasure from this. This army is technically part of the Federation, but in reality, they don't belong to the Federation. In other words, even the Federation is unaware of just how powerful they are. Once you get there, you'll find out how difficult it is to join this army. Rest here for today. You can go back tomorrow after you've recovered somewhat. We'll give you a few days to prepare, and you'll be setting off immediately right after you've fully recovered. Yang Ning was clearly intentionally keeping everything quite vague, so Tang Wuling naturally couldn't ask too many questions. An army that could be held in such high regard by the master of the Sea Gods Pavilion clearly wasn't any ordinary army. But what could they be? He didn't know much about the military, so he couldn't derive an answer no matter how much he thought about it. As such, he decided to abandon that train of thought altogether. He had experienced so many hardships already. All he had to do was overcome any obstacles that were thrown his way, regardless of what they were. Besides, this was just military training. It was no big deal. The stir that ran through the entire Shrek City by the sightings of golden plants quickly died down. In the eyes of most people, this had most likely been the result of one of the unfathomably powerful beings of Shrek Academy testing out one of their abilities. Of course, this incident enshrouded Shrek Academy in an extra layer of mystery and intrigue. 5 days later, Tang Wuling and his friends were ordered together on a plaza in the inner court of the academy. Elder Kai of the Sea Gods Pavilion was already there to greet them. The sense of foreboding in Tang Wuling's heart became even more pronounced at the sight of Elder Kai. Every time she assigned them with a mission, it was always quite a difficult mission to complete. Military training with a minimum duration of a year. Everyone else had also received this news, and just like Tang Wuling, they were also completely in the dark about just what this military training entailed. Tang Wuling looked at his friends, all of whom were also looking back at him. Tang Wuling had been living on the Sea Gods Island for the past few days, so this was their first meeting in a while. To be more accurate, Tang Wuling had rarely ever appeared before them during the past 6 months unless it was to forge uncommon medals for their suits of battle armor. He'd initially been planning to pay a visit to divine blacksmith Senhua, but he clearly didn't have any time to go now. He'd just have to wait until after this stint of military training. Feng Wuyu had already bestowed upon him the techniques, requirements, and cultivation methods required to succeed in soul forgeries. All that was left now was for him to find his own way. What's going on, Captain? Yue Tangyu asked in a quiet voice. He was standing right beside Tang Wuling while Xu Xiaoan was situated on the other side of the group, which was a clear indication that their relationship was still quite strained, despite the fact that everything seemed to have gone back to normal. Tang Wuling shook his head and replied, I don't know what this military training entails, either, but I can tell you that this is a punishment handed down to me by Elder Yan himself. Everyone's jaws fell to the ground in unison upon hearing this. Yan Ning was arguably the most powerful being on the entire Douluo continent. If this military training were a punishment that had been handed down by him, then there was no way that it was normal military training. At this moment, Elder Kai had already made her way over to them. She cleared her throat and said, You've all grown up, and military service is a mandatory undertaking for every citizen of the Federation. You've all come of age, so consider this your mandatory military service. There's no set time frame, but the military training will span a maximum of 2 years. I hope you can all complete it before coming back. I hope you can all complete it. Why did that sound so unsettling? She couldn't help but ask, Elder Kai, can you tell us what kind of military service this is going to be? Elder Kai glanced at him and replied, Do you think I can just go around spilling confidential information from the military? The only thing I can tell you is that less than 30 people from our academy have undertaken this military service, yet only 4 were able to complete the entire 2-year term. I was not one of those 4. A stunned look appeared on Tang Wuling's face. Do these 30 people also include the elders of the Sea Gods Pavilion? Elder Kai nodded in response. Of course, but not all of the elders have undertaken this military service. All right, there's no point for you to overthink things. You won't be getting any useful information from me anyway. As opposed to considering all of these pointless matters, it's better for you to make more preparations instead. I hope all of you can reap bountiful rewards from this stint of military service. Now then, I'm going to elaborate on some matters that need to be addressed. Chapter 783. Everyone immediately became more alert upon hearing this, and they began to appraise Elder Kai with intense focus in their eyes. Elder Kai continued, Firstly, you'll be traveling to the army on your own, so your first mission will be to get to your destination. I'll be giving you a map later on, and you'll have to get to the designated location according to the map. Secondly, in order to make this a more challenging exercise, you'll be stripped of all of your money and everything else aside from your suits of battle armor, and the items required to make your battle armor. Thirdly, after getting to the designated location, you have to follow the orders of your superiors no matter what. If anyone leaves without permission during the course of your military service, you'll be regarded as a deserter and be punished by expulsion. The more Tang Wuling heard, the more uneasy he became. Elder Kai, what do we have to do if we wish to withdraw from this stint of military service prior to its conclusion? Elder Kai replied, You have to submit an application, and only after providing proof that you're physically or mentally unable to continue will you be permitted to withdraw. Is that clear? A wry smile appeared on Tang Wuling's face. This really does sound like a very difficult undertaking. Elder Kai smiled upon hearing this, and her smile was even more unsettling than the one Yan Ming had given Tang Wuling a few days ago. Difficult. You're severely underestimating the task that lies ahead of you. Prepare yourselves. The route that will lead you to your destination has been named after one of the soul fusion skills between Spirit Ice Douluo Huo Yuao and Dragon Butterfly Douluo Tang Wutong. The name is Golden Road. Your first task will be to pass through this Golden Road and arrive at the designated location of your military training. Everything else will be made clear to you after you get there. Tang Wulin stepped forward to accept the map. Tang Wulin strode over to Elikai, and the latter handed a map over to him. I'll give all of you half an hour to bring out everything that doesn't have to do with your suits of battle armor. Your weapons are also an exception to this. We'll be checking to verify that you've submitted everything in half an hour, and following the verification process, you may depart. Of course, you won't be permitted to take any money with you, so you'll have to rely entirely on yourselves. Thus, Tang Wulin and his friends hurriedly rushed away to prepare for their upcoming journey. Jiwoshi strode over to Elikai from a dark corner in the distance and asked, "Aren't we being too cruel here?" Elikai shrugged in response. "This is the Pavilion Master's decision, not mine. In any case, I think it's a good thing that we're being a little cruel to them. At the very least, it'll allow them to go further. By the way, how long did you last back when you did your military training?" Jiwoshi sighed. 9 months. How about you? Elikai harumphed and gave no reply. Jiwoshi chuckled. "You didn't last as long as I did, right? 9 months is already a very exceptional result, aside from those freaks among freaks, who can complete all of those insane missions." Elikai smiled, as she said, "You're right, but I'll be relaying what you said to the freaks that you were referring to. What do you want to eat tonight, Maya? I'll invite you out to dinner." Tang Wulin didn't have many items he could take with him. Aside from his suit of battle armor, he only had his forging hammers and some uncommon metals left. The rest all had to be submitted for confiscation. Thankfully, he'd already forged all of the metals required to construct everyone's suits of battle armor, and he also taken some additional pieces of uncommon metals with him to practice his forging on. The military training sounded very grueling, but in reality, Tang Wulin wasn't overly concerned. After all, the training regimen that he devised for himself was already extremely arduous. He firmly believed that he'd be able to last through any military training that someone else had endured the full duration of. The checks conducted on them prior to their departure from the academy were more thorough than expected. However, none of them were planning to cheat the system in the first place, so the tests were completed quite quickly, and everyone departed from the academy. According to the requirements that they'd been given, they had to arrive at the military training location within 15 days. Otherwise, they'd lose the right to undertake military training. If that were to happen, they'd be expelled from the academy, and their titles as Shrek's 7 monsters would be revoked. After leaving the academy, Tang Wulin felt as if he arrived in another world, as it had been half a year since he'd last left the academy. He stretched his body vigorously, and a sense of exhaustion suddenly welled up in his heart. Regardless of how powerful his body was, forcing himself to work as hard as he could every single day for 6 months was still bound to take a heavy toll on him. Spiritual power and energy could be replenished through meditation, but accumulated mental fatigue was not that easy to eradicate. After leaving the academy, Tang Wulin finally relaxed for the first time in months, so he was naturally struck by a sense of exhaustion. "What do we do now, Captain?" "Set off on foot." Yue Zhengyu asked. All of them had changed into their own clothes, and Yue Zhengyu was in a set of white activewear that complemented his golden hair very well. However, the perpetual smile that was once on his face had faded, and it seemed that he'd matured quite significantly during the past 6 months. Just like Tang Wulin, he'd also spent most of his time during the past 6 months in seclusion. Tang Wulin replied, "It's definitely not a viable option to try and get there on foot. According to the designated location on the map, there's no way we'll be able to reach our destination in 15 days on foot. Let's go earn some money first. We can officially set off after that." Earning money was a very simple task to Tang Wulin. After all, his forging skills were always extremely sought after everywhere he went. On top of that, he had to go and visit his teacher as well. After arriving at the Shrek City Blacksmiths Association, Tang Wulin was immediately struck by a sense of nostalgia. Following his return, he only paid teacher Mu Chen one visit before he went into seclusion for half a year. Mu Chen had given him his forging experience journal, and Tang Wulin had saved up many questions that he wanted to ask Mu Chen. Different Saint blacksmiths took different paths to achieve soul refinement, and compared to the route that Feng Wuyu took, the path that Mu Chen had followed was more orthodox. Referencing these two sets of contrasting experiences would undoubtedly be very beneficial to Tang Wulin's own journey to soul refinement. Mu Chen was very surprised and elated by Tang Wulin's visit. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of the handsome young man standing before him. "You seem to have grown taller and more muscular, but you look a little tired," Mu Chen remarked with a smile. A wry smile appeared on Tang Wulin's face. "I don't know what happened. Either, this sense of exhaustion immediately appeared as soon as I left the academy. Teacher, the academy has organized a trial for us that's going to take a long time to complete, so I might be gone for a long time. I wanted to pay you a visit for my departure, and also," he paused momentarily and scratched his head before continuing, "the academy has imposed many restrictions on us, so all of our money was confiscated. I wanted to see if there were any forging missions that were available for me to complete so I can earn some money for the trip." Mu Chen burst into laughter upon hearing this. "That's not an issue. However, seeing as this is a requirement imposed on you by Shrek Academy, I can't just directly give you money. How about this? Choose a type of metal, and forge it to the highest level you're capable of. I want to see what progress you've made during the past 6 months. After that, the association will purchase that piece of metal according to the market price, and you'll definitely have enough money for your trip that way." "All right," Tang Wulin immediately agreed. Right at this moment, a familiar voice sounded from outside the door. "I'm back, father." Before Tang Wulin had a chance to turn around, a fragrant scent wafted into the room, and a gorgeous figure appeared at the doorway. She faltered slightly at the sight of so many people standing in Mu Chen's office, but she then quickly caught sight of the man standing directly before her father. Her footsteps immediately faltered, and her expression also stiffened. At this moment, Tang Wulin had already turned around, and he appraised the young woman with a smile as he greeted, "Hello, senior disciple sister." The one who had just walked in through the door was none other than Mu Zai. The last time that Tang Wulin had seen her was prior to his departure to the Douluo Empire. After that, he came back to participate in the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention, then went into seclusion following Gu Yue's disappearance. Chapter 784. As such, he hadn't seen Mu Zai for many years. In his memory, Mu Zai was still in the outer court of Shrek Academy and hadn't managed to make it into the inner court. She was already over 20 years of age now. She'd have to become a 2-word battle armor master prior to turning 30 if she wanted to enter the inner court. Tang Wulin suddenly realized that he knew next to nothing about Mu Zai. He had no idea what her current soul power rank was, nor how she'd been progressing in other areas. With this realization came a sense of guilt and apology. "You still recall that you have me as your senior disciple sister?" Mu Zai accused in a cold voice as she placed her hands on her hips. It had been 4 years since Tang Wulin had last seen Mu Zai, and even back then, she was already a splendid beauty. Now, she was already close to turning 23, and her beauty had flourished even further. Her figure had developed to perfection, and all of the male members of Shrek's 7 monsters couldn't help but take an extra glance at her as she walked in through the door. She wore a fiery red long dress and had a head of long wavy curls. Her beauty was like that of a scorching yet mesmerizing flame, just like her personality. A wry smile appeared on Tang Wulin's face. "I'm sorry, senior disciple sister." A series of complex emotions instantly welled up in Mu Zai's heart at the sight of Tang Wulin. She really wanted to pounce on him and give him a piece of her mind. He disappeared for over 3 years, and as soon as he returned, he went into seclusion in the inner court. She was prohibited from entering the inner court, so there was no way for her to meet him. The only time that she saw him was during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention. However, she was unable to participate in the event, so she could only look on from the shore as he expressed his love for Gu Yue before they got there happily ever after. In that instant, Mu Zai's heart had been filled with a smorgasbord of different emotions. The first time she'd met Tang Wulin, she'd been very disdainful toward him. However, after that, he earned her approval, and gradually, he became someone that she looked up to. In just a decade or so, he had become a truly exceptional man, and perhaps even the brightest star of Shrek Academy. At the same time, it seemed as if the distance between them was constantly widening. In some areas, Mu Zai felt the same way as with Sijuo. Both of them were perfectionists, and after seeing the best, they had no eyes for anything else. With Mu Zai's looks and background, she naturally had countless pursuers in Shrek Academy, and there were even inner court disciples who were interested in her. However, she'd firmly rejected all of their advances without any hesitation, as there had always been a figure in her heart that she couldn't forget. She was always trying to pursue him in forging, hoping that he would notice her if she could become just as adept a blacksmith as he was, but he simply left her further and further behind. Mu Zai wasn't a naive little girl who constantly lived in her dream world. After witnessing Tang Wulin choosing someone else during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention, she had told herself that this man had nothing to do with her. However, just as she was gradually getting over him, he suddenly appeared before her. Just a simple apology from him suddenly made it impossible for her to to vent all of the fury and indignation she built up toward him. Ahem. Mu Chen cleared his throat to alleviate the awkward atmosphere slightly. He was Mu Zai's father, so he was naturally aware of her thoughts and feelings. However, Tang Wulin was like a true dragon that was just beginning to rise into the heavens, and relationships simply couldn't be forced. The two of them simply weren't meant to be. Mu Chen had once tried to tell Mu Zai in a roundabout manner that her personality was too overbearing, and that Tang Wulin definitely wasn't the type of person who would be willing to be controlled by others. Both of them were very competitive, and when two competitive people came together, perhaps it was possible for them to become friends, but it was far too difficult for them to become lovers. Wulin asked me to assess his forging skills. Seeing as you've come back, you can have a look as well. Mu Chen made his way over to his daughter before patting her on the shoulder. The complex emotions in Mu Zai's eyes gradually faded. After all, she was already an adult, and regardless of how stubborn her personality was, she certainly wasn't going to embarrass her father by throwing a fit like a spoiled child. All right. Tang Wulin was starting to sweat under Mu Zai's scorching gaze, and even the sense of exhaustion that he'd been afflicted with earlier had been instantly burned away. Mu Chen said, "Let's go to my forging room." Everyone followed Mu Chen to his private forging room, which contained almost all types of uncommon metals that had been discovered thus far on the Douluo continent. Mu Chen made an inviting hand gesture to Tang Wulin, and the latter paused momentarily before making his way over to the metal that was most familiar to him. Thus, he quickly picked up a standard-sized block of heavy silver before placing it on the anvil. Mu Zai raised an eyebrow in an insulting manner, and scoffed, "That's it? Heavy silver?" Tang Wulin replied with a smile, "It's the metal I'm most familiar with." Indeed, he was most familiar with heavy silver, not only because this was the first uncommon metal he'd come into contact with, but also because he had an extremely in-depth understanding of this material. Tang Wulin's forging hammers were still his heavy silver hammers, and every time he'd made a breakthrough in his forging, it had always been through refining heavy silver. This was partially due to how familiar he was with heavy silver, and at the same time, it created a placebo effect. All of his breakthroughs had been made with heavy silver on the anvil, so he developed the subconscious feeling that heavy silver was his lucky metal, which was why he'd chosen it again. Mu Zai didn't say anything further. She only looked on with rapt focus in her eyes. She had worked extremely hard during the past few years, and if Tang Wulin didn't exist, she would be the undisputed #1 prodigy of the Blacksmiths Association. She was only 23 years of age, yet Mu Chen had already acknowledged her as a suitable heir to him in the art of forging. The current Mu Zai was also a 6th rank blacksmith, and even though she had made it to the 6th rank slightly later than Tang Wulin, she definitely wasn't late by much. If it weren't for the fact that she'd spent so much time and effort on honing her forging skills, she may have had a chance of making it into the inner court. However, her forging skill had also been of immense benefit to her. She had already begun to prepare the metals required for her suit of 2-word battle armor, and she was going to be using spirit-refined alloys. She was determined to become a 2-word battle armor master prior to turning 30 so she could become a member of Shrek Academy's inner court. Furthermore, her cultivation rank had also exceeded 50, so she was a sulking already. She was very exceptional in all areas, and she was very confident in herself, as well as the effort she put in. As such, she wanted to see whether she had caught up to him after working so hard for 4 years. Tang Wulin placed a piece of heavy silver onto the forging bench to calcine it. At the same time, he pulled out his pair of spirit-refined heavy silver hammers with a serious expression on his face, and he closed his eyes as he waited in tranquil silence. Even though Mu Zai was very angry at him, she still had to admit that Tang Wulin was her biggest competition in the world of blacksmiths, and even a target that she had always been pursuing. He had been a 6th rank blacksmith for over 4 years, yet he could still maintain such a calm and steady demeanor during his forging. He was only 19 years old, but his mental fortitude in forging rivaled that of even her father. He was immovable like a mountain. Mu Chen was also spectating off to the side, while the 6 other members of Shrek's 7 monsters were standing slightly further away in case they distracted Tang Wulin by standing too close. Tang Wulin placed his hammers onto the forging bench, and his arms hung by his side in a relaxed manner. There was an indescribable disposition about him, and in that instant, he seemed to no longer be a human being. Instead, it was as if he'd become a part of the forging room. It was very easy to judge the amount of time required to calcine heavy silver, and all of a sudden, Tang Wulin pressed a button, upon which the red-hot piece of heavy silver gradually rose up. Almost at the exact same moment, Tang Wulin opened his eyes and gripped onto his pair of forging hammers. He then reached out with his hammers in a rather tentative manner instead of slamming them down onto the piece of heavy silver right away. Mu Chen was surprised to see that Tang Wulin was essentially drumming the piece of heavy silver with his pair of hammers. Instead of swinging his forging hammers down with all his might as he normally did, the 2 hammers hung above the piece of heavy silver, and he was using only his wrists to control them, striking the piece of heavy silver with one delicate hammer blow after another. This was the first time Mu Zai had seen anyone forge like this. Even her own father, who was a saint blacksmith, wouldn't forge like this. Tang Wulin's hammers drummed against the piece of heavy silver in a light yet consistent manner. Can metals really be successfully refined like this? This thought had only just occurred to Mu Zai before her expression completely stiffened. She discovered that even though Tang Wulin was being extremely delicate with his hammer blows, the piece of heavy silver was rapidly shrinking. What was even more remarkable was that the piece of metal was beginning to glow brighter and brighter. Mu Zai could even see some fine and orderly patterns appearing over the surface of the piece of heavy silver. How can such delicate hammer blows purify a piece of metal? Tang Wulin's wrists were moving extremely quickly, resulting in a rapid string of light clangs that almost stretched into a single continuous sound. What was even more remarkable was that this drumming was extremely rhythmic and pleasing to the ears, as if he were playing a musical instrument. Chapter 785. His hammers were moving so quickly that a series of afterimages were being left in their wake, completely enshrouding the piece of heavy silver. At this moment, Tang Wulin resembled a sculptor more than a blacksmith, and he seemed to be carefully carving the piece of metal into his next masterpiece. It was exactly because of his familiarity with heavy silver that he found it easier to control it. As such, refinement of heavy silver had already become second nature to him. If he wanted to bring out all of the true characteristics in a piece of uncommon metal, or in other words, to elevate it and bestow upon it life, then he had to retain its original unique characteristics and ensure that he didn't damage it. In the past, he would always forge metals by directly purifying them before refining them. However, Tang Wulin could now see that metals themselves possess souls, even prior to undergoing spirit refinement. Each and every piece of uncommon metal was like a living creature, and if excessively heavy hammer blows were used during the purification process, that would inevitably inflict damage to the body of the piece of metal. Different methods could be used to strengthen the piece of metal later on, but irreversible damage had already been done at that point, and there was no way to forge the piece of metal to the extreme. As such, if one wanted to forge a piece of uncommon metal to perfection, then they had to carefully and delicately refine it in the beginning. An analogy could be drawn here to the human body. If a person had impurities in one of their meridians, that meridian could be compressed vigorously to expel the impurities by force. However, doing so would inevitably damage the meridian to a certain extent. If a more gentle and subtle method were to be used instead to gradually clear out the meridian, then the impurities would be refined, thereby clearing the meridian, while the meridian itself remained completely unscathed. This was the difference between Tang Wulin's past and present forging. During the forging process, he took extreme care in controlling his forging hammers, almost caressing the piece of heavy silver rather than striking it. Furthermore, with each hammer blow that struck the piece of heavy silver, he injected a wisp of his bloodline aura into the metal so it could develop a better sense of his aura. At his current strength, if he were to strike the piece of heavy silver with all his might, not only would the piece of metal be reduced to a pancake, even his forging hammers could fall apart from the enormous force of the impact. This was also an important reason why he had to be very careful during the forging process. At this point, he completely immersed himself in his craft, and it took him 3 times the amount of time that was normally required to complete 100 refinement. If one were to carefully assess the piece of heavy silver, they discovered that the Tang Wulin's purification process resulted in a slightly larger piece of 100 refined heavy silver than normal. During the purification process, it was often the case that some good things would also be expelled along with the impurities, but he had been able to completely avoid that. Mu Chen looked on at everything that Tang Wulin was doing with an intense gaze and an elated look in his eyes. This hammer technique hadn't been taught to him by Mu Chen nor by Feng Wuyu. Instead, he had invented it himself. The Tang Sex disorder splitting wind hammer technique was very effective, but it was too violent violent and too damaging to the metal being forged. Even though the technique was still extremely effective for forging, it was very difficult to improve to the next level while using such a violent technique. It was undoubtedly the case that Tang Wulin had found his own path and was progressing steadily along it. Around 15 minutes later, a burst of dazzling silver light suddenly erupted upward, and a clear dragon's roar also rang out with the emergence of that light. That streak of silver light was like a worm rising up into the heavens. The heavy silver had been refined with spirit. However, under most circumstances, most metals that were 1000 refined with spirit only release light that rose up to around 5 feet tall at most. But the streak of silver light rising up from the piece of heavy silver stretched all the way to around 10 feet in height. Furthermore, it was rising upward in a wavy trajectory, as if it were mimicking a silver dragon dancing through the wind. Mu Zai's eyes widened in shock. She was also a 6th rank blacksmith, but she was sure that she'd be unable to do what Tang Wulin had just done. Extreme 1000 refinement. Mu Chen murmured to himself. Indeed, Tang Wulin had completed 1000 refinement on this piece of heavy silver to the extreme, meaning that he had perfected the process and that there was no room for improvement. Even Mu Chen wasn't confident that he'd be able to accomplish this, let alone Mu Zai. Perhaps only divine blacksmiths and who could replicate this feat. Forging required strength, but the more strength that was used, the more a blacksmith would have to sacrifice on control. It was impossible for Mu Chen to refine metals using just the power of his wrists as Tang Wulin was doing, as he simply wasn't strong enough to accomplish that. He could perhaps replicate this by using soul power, but that would further hamper his control, and it would be a lot more difficult to control than if he were to use pure strength. However, this was something that clearly wasn't beyond Tang Wulin's capabilities. His strength had already exceeded the 100-ton mark, so even just the power in his wrists was extremely fearsome. Throughout this entire refinement process thus far, he hadn't even used a single shred of soul power. He had only drawn upon his bloodline power slightly, and the rest of this procedure had been accomplished through pure strength. Only then could he complete 1000 refinement to such a degree of perfection. Tang Wulin took a deep breath and spread open his pair of heavy silver hammer by his sides as the streak of silver light rose up into the air. His eyes began to glow as his heavy silver hammer circled through the air, and before the streak of silver light had completely faded, his hammers had struck the piece of heavy silver again. On this occasion, the sound of the hammer striking the piece of 1000 refined heavy silver was a lot clearer and crisper. If one were to look closely at the piece of heavy silver now, they discovered that there was a layer of fine patterns running all over its surface. The patterns themselves were radiating dazzling light, and it was as if the piece of heavy silver had been transformed into another type of metal altogether. Tang Wulin wasn't using solely the power of his wrist anymore. Following extreme 1000 refinement with spirit, the internal structure of the piece of heavy silver had already been completely aligned, and it was countless times harder than it was before, thereby finally making it able to withstand Tang Wulin's strength. His eyes glowed as he completely spread open his spiritual world, and spiritual power surged forth in a frenzy before it was injected into the piece of heavy silver in a gentle manner through the use of his hammers. Spiritual power and blood essence power combined, and Mu Chen could clearly hear that with each strike Tang Wulin dealt to the piece of heavy silver, it would emit a faint dragon's roar. The patterns on its surface would also be adjusted slightly. Soul power injection, spiritual power injection. At this point, Tang Wulin had already begun the most important step to spirit refinement, giving life. The main difference between spirit refinement and 1000 refinement was the level of sentience that was attained by the piece of metal being refined. The more sentience a piece of uncommon metal possessed, the more valuable it became. Most 5th and 6th rank blacksmiths were unable to guarantee spirit refinement with every single piece of metal they forged, but Tang Wulin was able to do so. Mu Zai was capable of this as well, as they were both among the cream of the crop of 6th rank blacksmiths, and they already set their sights beyond the 6th rank long ago. However, Mu Zai could sense that Tang Wulin's spirit refinement was completely different from hers. His method of calling expended a lot more power than the power that she expended during this procedure. The amount of soul power being injected was quite normal, but he seemed to have released far too much spiritual power, and there also seemed to be something extra intermingled in there, as evidenced by the dragon roars being emitted by the piece of heavy silver. Under normal circumstances, such a special type of sound shouldn't appear during this stage, and this could only mean that Tang Wulin had added his own extra twist to his refinement. Tang Wulin brought his hammers down over and over again in an extremely steady and consistent manner. He wasn't being as delicate as he was in the beginning, but his hammer blows didn't appear to be all that heavy, either. He was simply striking the piece of heavy silver with moderate power. The patterns on the piece of heavy silver gradually began to transform, and as Tang Wulin continued to inject his soul power into the piece of metal, light began to ripple around it in a rhythmic manner. Is it beginning to attain sentience already? This is way too soon for that. Compared to the slow 100 and 1000 refinements that Tang Wulin had completed, the speed at which he was completing spirit refinement was so astonishing that Mu Zai's jaw had completely fallen onto the ground. If she had been in Tang Wulin's shoes, it would take her at least an hour to complete spirit refinement on even the more ordinary types of uncommon metals. After all, detecting and activating a piece of uncommon metal's life force was certainly far from a simple task. At this point, Tang Wulin hadn't completed spirit refinement yet, but the metal had clearly already begun to attain sentience, which meant that completion of spirit refinement was imminent. Chapter 786. Everything was happening way too quickly. It had only been 5 minutes since he'd begun the spirit refinement process. According to Mu Zai's knowledge, even the veteran blacksmiths who'd been stuck at the 6th rank for several decades couldn't complete spirit refinement in just 5 minutes. There was a virtually insurmountable gulf between spirit refinement and soul refinement. Countless blacksmiths were unable to take this step, and that was why Saint blacksmiths were so rare. However, even Mu Chen couldn't complete spirit refinement in just 5 minutes. Was this the effect of the extreme 1000 refinement that Tang Wulin had completed? At this moment, Mu Zai had already forgotten all of her complex emotions toward Tang Wulin, and she'd been completely absorbed in his forging. Buzz. Right at this moment, a faint buzzing sound rang out from the piece of heavy silver, and it shuddered slightly, following which the patterns on its surface seemed to have sprung to life. The patterns rearranged themselves to form the shape of a dragon, and the faint dragon's roars emanating from the piece of metal instantly became clearer and more pronounced. A burst of elation erupted from the piece of heavy silver. Tang Wulin had successfully completed spirit refinement from 1000 refinement in just 7 minutes. Even Mu Chen's eyes widened upon seeing this, and he reflexively clenched his fists. He had just received a glimmer of inspiration from watching Tang Wulin's forging, and for a Saint blacksmith, this type of inspiration was indescribably important. Mu Chen had thought that it would be impossible for him to become a divine blacksmith during this lifetime, but in that instant, he suddenly felt as if he had a slight chance after all. That was an indication of just how profound an effect Tang Wulin's forging had on him. Tang Wulin paused momentarily here, and a faint smile appeared on his face as if he were listening to the heavy silver's cry of elation. The piece of metal was like a newborn child showing off to its father. In the next instant, the aura emanating from Tang Wulin's body transformed dramatically. Powerful blood essence fluctuations erupted forth, and countless golden scales appeared all over his skin, giving him a rather intimidating appearance. Only the skin on his neck and his 2 arms were visible, and those sections of his body had already been completely covered in scales. Golden scales had also appeared over his hands, but his golden dragon claws didn't emerge. Even so, the powerful blood essence fluctuations erupting from his body still gave Mu Chen and Mu Zai huge fright. The immense bloodline intimidation had even forced Mu Zai to unleash her martial soul, and a series of soul rings emerged beneath her feet. Mu Chen wasn't forced to such an extent, but he was still quite startled by this development. This aura. He had felt Tang Wulin's blood essence fluctuations a long time ago, but they had never been this immensely powerful. How could his aura be so potent? Furthermore, they could see golden rings of light emerging from beneath Tang Wulin's feet, and a total of 4 rings appeared in quick succession. Last time Mu Zai had seen these blood essence soul rings, Tang Wulin had only had 2 of them. He spread open his arms, and his body shuddered slightly as the bloodline aura intensified even further. Golden light began to revolve around his body, and his eyes had also turned golden in color. The piece of heavy silver seemed to have also sensed the aura fluctuations emanating from Tang Wulin's body, and its elation gradually turned into intrigue and curiosity. Right at this moment, Tang Wulin's hammers sprang into action again. At this point, both of his heavy silver hammers had already taken on a golden hue from his blood essence power. The hammer blows he delivered this time were extremely heavy, and no longer bore any semblance of the delicate touch he had before. With each and every hammer blow he struck, the entire forging room would tremble slightly, and it was as if a string of explosions were being set off in the room. Every time the piece of spirit-refined heavy silver was struck, it would emit a whimpering moan, as if it were experiencing pain and pleasure in equal measure. Furthermore, Muzai could see that in the face of Tang Wulin's hammer blows, the heavy silver had taken on a golden color. This color would fade in an instant following each blow, but it was undoubtedly the case that it was being affected by his heavy silver hammers. The main difference between spirit refinement and soul refinement was that spirit refinement bestowed life upon a piece of metal, yet soul refinement passed on one's inheritance to the piece of metal. It was just like soul spirit inheritance. As such, for one-word and two-word battle armor masters, the ideal secondary occupation was to be a mecha maker, as only then would they be able to create battle armor that suited themselves the most. After all, no one knew a person better than themselves. However, after becoming a three-word or even four-word battle armor master, the most important element of one's suit of battle armor would become the metals used, as that was the stage where soul-refined metals became a necessity. If the battle armor master were a saint blacksmith themselves, then the metal they forged would possess their soul power, and even special characteristics from their martial soul. As such, that suit of battle armor would undoubtedly be extremely synergistic with the battle armor master. This was even more important than the circuits used. Unfortunately, being a blacksmith was one of the most difficult secondary occupations, and there were only a dozen or so saint blacksmiths on the entire Douluo continent, while Zhenhua was the only divine blacksmith on the entire continent. Those statistics alone were a clear indication of just how difficult it was to progress in this occupation. At this moment, Tang Wulin was undoubtedly beginning to progress from spirit refinement to soul refinement. He was injecting his bloodline aura into the piece of heavy silver with all his might, and at the same time, he was injecting into it his soul and his own aura. Soul refinement didn't just involve refining a piece of metal from the outside. It was also an internal process that involved infusing one's aura, soul power, and spiritual power into a piece of metal. Only then could they forge a connection with the piece of metal itself and refine it from the inside. The combination of external and internal refinement would activate all of the metal's special properties and also infuse the blacksmith's powers into the piece of metal. It was sometimes said that soul refined metals were clones of the saint blacksmiths who had forged them. This was a slight exaggeration, but it wasn't entirely nonsensical. Spirit refinement could bestow sentience upon a piece of metal, thereby allowing it to attain certain abilities that normal metals didn't possess, such as self-regeneration. However, soul refinement was different. Soul refined metals made soul masters feel as if they had a friend by their side. Suits of battle armor created using soul refined metals were like second lives for the battle armor masters they belonged to, and they could even follow some orders and instructions. Of course, if one were to blacksmith themselves, then the first thing they had to do before having their suit of three-word battle armor constructed would be to communicate with the metals that their battle armor was going to be constructed from. Due to the fact that battle armor masters would have already become very intimate with their suits of two-word battle armor, this process could be accomplished, even though it could take a very long time. However, battle armor masters who were also blacksmiths could skip this process. After commencing the soul refinement process, Tang Wulin had clearly become a lot more cautious. Every single hammer blow was extremely heavy, and his powerful bloodline fluctuations were being injected into the piece of heavy silver without any reservation. As time passed, it took longer and longer for the golden hue to fade from the piece of heavy silver after it was struck by his hammers. It was often the case that the golden color hadn't even had a chance to completely fade from Tang Wulin's last hammer blow before he struck it again. Thus, the piece of heavy silver began to maintain a perpetually golden state. Tang Wulin was swinging his hammers with mechanical precision, and the frequency of the hammer strikes was gradually decreasing. Clang! Ding! All of a sudden, a crisp echo resonated from within the piece of heavy silver following a hammer blow from Tang Wulin. Mu Chen's entire body abruptly shuddered upon hearing this sound. Resonance. This seemed to be something very ordinary and mundane, to the extent that the 6 other members of Shrek's 7 monsters didn't even notice it. However, it was like the most delightful music to his ears, as he knew far too well what this sound entailed. Soul refinement was extremely difficult, and resonance was a precursor of successful soul refinement. It meant that all of the types of energy that had been injected into the piece of metal had been combined, thereby allowing it to be refined from the inside. This was an extremely important step, and also the most difficult step in soul refinement. Many 6th-ranked blacksmiths couldn't achieve this even after toiling away for their entire lives. Soul refinement resonance was also an indication of how well a blacksmith knew a piece of metal, and it showed that all of the preparatory work that had been done beforehand hadn't gone to waste. Tang Wulin's expression remained unchanged, and he continued in his forging. As expected, with each and every hammer blow, the metal would resonate with him, and the sound was only becoming more and more pronounced. Muzai's eyes widened even further. Could it be that he's already able to? She had thought that the gap between them had dwindled, but if he'd already taken that step, then they would no longer even be on the same level. Mu Chen had told her that with her current rate of progress and how hard she was currently working, she should be able to attempt a breakthrough to become a saint blacksmith when she turned 30. But what about Tang Wulin? He was only 19 years old, yet he'd already achieved soul refinement resonance. In contrast, she had no idea how to get to this step. Everyone had different blood essence, soul power, and spiritual power. As such, there was no set technique to soul refinement. A teacher could only pass on feelings and experiences, and the blacksmith had to find their own way. Muzai was currently at this stage, but never would she have thought that Tang Wulin would have already mastered the most difficult step to soul refinement. Chapter 787. What was next? It was the process of soul refinement solidification. Following the completion of that step, 70% of the soul refinement process would have been completed. Only the final soul summoning would be required before success was achieved in soul refinement. It was undoubtedly the case that heavy silver was one of the easiest uncommon metals to forge, but a soul refined piece of heavy silver would still fetch an astronomical price. After soul refinement, a piece of uncommon metal could no longer be referred to as such. Instead, it would become a true spirit item. The frequency of Tang Wulin's hammer blows began to increase, and his blood essence power was so immense that he still showed no signs of tiring at all. Instead, the golden light radiating from his body only became brighter and brighter. At this point, the piece of heavy silver had already turned completely golden in color, and dragon roars rang out from within it alongside the clear soul refinement resonance. These were all very positive signs. All of a sudden, the golden piece of heavy silver shuddered violently, and it suddenly jumped up from the forging bench. Look out! That's the shock of life. It's trying to get away. Metals that had been given life would attain intelligence at some point during the soul refinement process. At that moment, it would become extremely panicked as it didn't want to be controlled by humans, and it would try to run away. If it were to escape from the control of the blacksmith, then its soul would quickly fade away as it hadn't completely solidified yet, thereby making it revert back to the spirit refinement stage. At that point, it would be impossible to complete soul refinement with that piece of metal again. Tang Wulin remained unflustered as he let loose a cold cry. Get back here. His third golden soul ring abruptly lit up as he spoke, and the piece of golden heavy silver shuddered before falling back down onto the forging bench amid a loud clang. This was his golden dragon's roar. This piece of heavy silver already possessed Tang Wulin's bloodline aura, and in the face of the intimidation from Tang Wulin's golden dragon king bloodline, it was completely powerless to resist. Tang Wulin took a deep breath before raising his hammers and bringing them down again. He had already begun the next step, soul solidification. The golden light emanating from Tang Wulin's eyes became tinged with purple, and as he brought his hammers down over and over again, he was releasing less bloodline aura, but increasing his output of spiritual power. 2 bursts of purplish golden light erupted from his eyes, each of which was around a foot in length. He was using a spiritual attack from his purple demon eyes directly on this piece of metal. The shuddering from the piece of heavy silver immediately began to subside, and in the face of Tang Wulin's spiritual attack and forging hammers, the golden color on its surface began to fade, revealing its original patterns. Those patterns had already taken on the form of extremely lifelike scales that were identical to the scales on Tang Wulin's body. Both Mu Chen and Muzai reflexively began to breathe in a heavier manner. The soul solidification process seemed to be also progressing very smoothly. At this rate, it really did appear that he could successfully complete soul refinement. Even if he could only complete soul refinement once, he would officially progress from a 6th rank blacksmith to the 7th, which would make him a new saint blacksmith. Even in the entire Shrek Academy, there was only one saint blacksmith in the form of Feng Wuyu. If Tang Wulin were to become a saint blacksmith, then his social status on the entire Douluo continent would become completely different. He would truly become a member of the upper echelons of society, and he could even become the president of the blacksmith association in a major city if he wanted to. Even more importantly, he was only 19 years old, and there was a great chance that he'd be able to strive toward becoming a divine blacksmith in the future. Zhenhua held such a lofty status on this continent continent, that even the Federation's parliament, the Spirit Pagoda, and Shrek Academy wouldn't dare to offend him for no good reason. Following the assassination attempts that had been made against Denhua, the Spirit Pagoda and the Federation had joined forces to conduct an extermination operation, and as a result of that, evil soul masters had remained dormant to this very day. These were all clear indications of what a truly exceptional blacksmith meant to the world of soul masters. More and more golden dragon scales appeared, all the way until they had covered the entire piece of heavy silver. The golden around the piece of metal began to withdraw, and the metal itself began to shimmer in a rhythmic manner. Soul solidification, success. Mu Chen couldn't help but swing an arm through the air in elation. Soul refinement resonance and soul refinement solidification were both extremely arduous processes, and if one could complete both of those procedures, then they were virtually guaranteed to become a saint blacksmith at some point. The final soul summoning process was very difficult, but this was something that could be honed over time. Tang Wolin was still refining the piece of heavy silver, and the blood essence fluctuations emanating from his body were finally beginning to weaken, but he didn't dare to pause even for a single moment. He had chosen to use his blood essence power to complete soul refinement as opposed to using his soul power, and this was simply because he didn't have sufficient soul power. Normal soul refinements would require at least the soul power of a 7-ring soul sage to complete. Tang Wolin was far from that level. His blood essence power also couldn't compare with the soul power of a 7-ring soul sage, but the difference lay in the fact that he possessed the bloodline of the Golden Dragon King. This was a bloodline of an extremely high caliber, and during the soul refinement process, it was far easier to fuse and control his blood essence power compared to his soul power. If Tang Wolin were to use his soul power alone in his refinement, he wouldn't even be able to get to the soul refinement resonance stage. Yet he was able to accomplish this with his blood essence power. Both hammers fell at once, and a crisp clang rang out as a burst of dazzling golden light suddenly erupted from the piece of heavy silver. There seemed to be a dragon-shaped projection revolving around the piece of metal within the golden light. Tang Wolin took a deep breath before letting loose a low cry, and his aura immediately became more potent. His eyes glowed as he struck the piece of metal with his hammers in an alternating manner. Immediately thereafter, a loud dragon's roar erupted from his body, and his first golden soul ring lit up. It was none other than his golden dragon body. The process of soul summoning entailed summoning a piece of metal soul with the power that had been previously injected into it, thereby creating resonance. If this process was successfully completed, the soul within the piece of metal would be truly brought to life. Spirit-refined metals only possessed life force, which made them similar to plants, whereas soul-refined metals that attained souls were more like soul beasts. This was the true essence of soul refinement, and it meant that successful soul refinement would transform a piece of metal into a true living being. The process was akin to the miracle of giving life, which was why it was so difficult. Loud dragon's roars reverberated throughout the entire forging room, and the piece of metal was also ringing incessantly. However, Tang Wolin's brows quickly furrowed. The process of soul summoning was too difficult, and in reality, he hadn't attempted it many times in the past. He had only been able to successfully complete soul refinement resonance and soul refinement solidification on a total of 2 or 3 occasions prior to this. Soul summoning couldn't be taught as everyone's forging processes were different. There was no set formula that could be given, and one had to find that feeling on their own. All of a sudden, the piece of heavy silver shattered violently before abruptly falling silent. A dejected look appeared on Tang Wolin's face. He had failed. There was only an extremely short window of time during which soul summoning could be completed. Following soul solidification, the soul of the piece of metal would be active for an instant, and if soul summoning could be completed during that split second, it would evolve to become a new life form, thereby heralding a successful soul refinement. If soul summoning couldn't be achieved, then it would remain in this soul refinement solidified state. Golden light was flashing from the golden scales on the piece of heavy silver, indicating that it had attained a high level of sentient will, but unfortunately, it was never going to be able to become a complete life form like a soul beast. A large and strong hand gripped onto Tang Wolin's shoulder. You've already done very well. Don't place too much pressure on yourself. Tang Wolin turned around and was greeted by the sight of Mu Chen's smiling face. If you really can successfully complete soul refinement, then I'll be too embarrassed to continue in my role as president of this association. You've already completed the solidification process, which means that this piece of metal is already half-step soul refined. Even your uncle master would be very pleased to hear about this. In just a few years, you've already reached a stage where you're just one step away from becoming a saint blacksmith. We were right about you. If you continue developing at this speed, you'll definitely become a divine blacksmith in the future. Tang Wolin scratched his head in a slightly embarrassed manner. You're far too kind, teacher. There are still many fallacies in my forging, and I still haven't even begun to grasp the concept of soul summoning. The procedures prior to that step expend too much energy, so there's a very slim chance for me to complete that final step. Whenever I get to that stage, my energy would be insufficient to carry me through it. Mu Chen said in a meaningful voice, forging is a process of accumulation. Among the 3 major obstacles of soul refinement, the most difficult one is soul refinement resonance. This is not something that one can achieve just by working hard. Luck and talent play far bigger roles in that regard. Almost all blacksmiths who have achieved soul refinement resonance have gone on to become saint blacksmiths. Yet you've even gone one step further and achieved soul refinement solidification as well. All you need is to accumulate more experience and increase your cultivation rank, including that of your spiritual power. The more you improve in those areas, the clearer the soul summoning stage will become to you. Barring any mishaps, you'll definitely become a saint blacksmith in the future. It's only a matter of time. Chapter 788. Tang Wolin nodded with a smile. Thank you, teacher. How much do you think this piece of heavy silver can sell for? Muzai couldn't help but purse her lips. You haven't changed at all in that regard. Is money the only thing you see? She was unaware that Tang Wolin required funds to support his mission. Mu Chen glared at her before a smile returned to his face, and he said, "There's no need to sell this. I'm keeping this as part of my collection. You're my most exceptional disciple, and I'm going to show off this piece of metal to everyone at the Blacksmith Association headquarters. Even your uncle master would be green with envy. Ha ha ha." After reaching the half-step soul refinement stage, you have the right to name your own metal. Tang Wolin's heart stirred, and he hurriedly said, "Teacher, why don't you give it a name in my stead?" Mu Chen looked at Tang Wolin with a surprised expression. For a saint blacksmith, it was a great honor to be able to name their own metals, and very rarely would anyone offer this opportunity to someone else. Mu Chen was still hesitating about whether it was right to accept this offer, but Tang Wolin urged in a heartfelt manner, "Teacher, I wouldn't be where I am today without your instructions, so please don't turn me down." Mu Chen burst into laughter upon hearing this. "All right. Nothing makes me happier than being able to do something like this. Seeing as this piece of heavy silver is covered in dragon scales, why don't we name it dragon scale heavy silver? All of your soul refined metals can have the prefix of dragon scale before their names. What do you think? Scale also has the same pronunciation as the Lin character in your name, so that also forges a connection between yourself and your soul refined metals. The Lin character in Tang Wolin is the same Lin in the mythological creature, Qilin, while the Chinese character for scale has the exact same pronunciation. That sounds great. From that day forth, all of the names for Tang Wolin's future soul refined metals had been decided. Once an uncommon metal was given a name, its value would increase to an incredible degree. Furthermore, the attributes of soul refined metals differed depending on which saint blacksmith they'd been refined by, so not all soul masters could use the soul refined metals forged by the same saint blacksmith. Tang Wolin's future soul refined metals were going to be infused with his golden dragon king bloodline, thereby making the metals of an extremely high caliber even among soul refined metals. With these attributes, it would be suitable for almost all battle armor masters, especially for assault and power system battle armor masters. Following Tang Wolin's experimentation, he discovered that this piece of half-step soul refined metal could even ward off his golden dragon king bloodline intimidation, as it also contained the same bloodline aura. If all of his friends could wear battle armor constructed from his dragon scale metals, then they wouldn't be affected by his bloodline aura during battle. Mu Chen gave Tang Wolin 5 million federal credits, which was more than enough to cover the costs of their journey. If this piece of dragon scale heavy silver were to be sold on the free market, it would almost definitely fetch a higher price than that, even if it were only half-step soul refined. However, the fact that the piece of metal had been accepted by Mu Chen for his collection gave it special meaning. "I'm going now, senior disciple sister." Tang Wolin waved at Muzai at the front gate of the Blacksmith Association. Muzai had treated him in a very cold and resentful manner this entire time, but she still accompanied him all the way to the front gate prior to his departure. At the sight of Tang Wolin's smiling face, Muzai bit down on her lower lips, and she suddenly rushed over before enveloping him in a tight hug. Tang Wolin was rather taken aback by her tight embrace, and Muzai sobbed into his ear, "Take care, Wolin." Before he had a chance to say anything in reply, Muzai had already released him and ran back into the building as quickly as she could. Her unique fragrance still lingered, and a sense of loss welled up in Tang Wolin's heart. This sense of loss didn't just stem from separation. The feeling also arose from the fact that in that moment, Tang Wolin suddenly realized that he was no longer a child. He was an adult, and the carefree days of his childhood were permanently behind him. From now on, the burden on his shoulders would only become heavier. "Are you unwilling to let her go?" Shishi chuckled in a low voice right beside his ear. Tang Wuling swatted him on the head in a cranky manner. A medium-sized bus that could carry 20 passengers soon rolled up before them. This was a vehicle that Mu Chen had organized for them, and it would take them to the railway station. In all honesty, Tang Wuling had already been slightly traumatized by soul trains. He had experienced such terrible luck a few times he'd traveled by train, and that had led to an instinctive sense of aversion toward this mode of transportation. However, he had to admit that a soul train was going to get them to their destination as quickly as possible. They were running on a time limit of 15 days, and from the tone of Elder Kai's voice, as well as her expressions, it could be deduced that it was not going to be an easy task to get to their destination. As such, they had to conserve time wherever possible. Furthermore, they were not the children they had once been. All of them were one-word battle armor masters, and there were 7 of them traveling together. This was already quite a formidable force. As such, after some careful consideration, Tang Wuling still decided to take a high-speed train en route to their destination. Thus, they arrived at the train station before buying their tickets. During this process, Tang Wuling refrained from using the privilege that had been given to him. After boarding the train, Tang Wuling fell asleep before it had even departed from the station. The train was filled with rows of 2-person seats, and Tang Wuling was sitting together with Yue Hengyu. Shu Lizzie was sitting with Yu Xinglan, and Shi, Yuan and Yui, and Xu Shaoan took up a 3-person seat. Yue Hengyu was intrigued by how slow and even Tang Wuling's breathing had become, and as he turned toward him, he was surprised to find that Tang Wuling had already fallen asleep. He was far too exhausted, not just from cultivation for these past 6 months in the academy, but also from the draining experience of attempting soul refinement. He sat beside a window and had fallen into a deep sleep. His handsome face was very placid, and even in a state of slumber, he was like the male version of Sleeping Beauty. Yue Hengyu glanced at Tang Wuling before casting his gaze blankly into the distance. During these past 6 months, he'd also accumulated a lot of fatigue. Ever since he'd been rejected by Xu Shaoan during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention, he had changed significantly. Her rejection had dealt him an extremely heavy blow, and after helping Tang Wuling search for Gu Yue for a few days to no avail, he stayed in his dorm room for an entire month. He was too ashamed to meet anyone, and his pride simply couldn't handle such a severe blow. He gradually began to understand what the problem with his confession had been, yet his ego prevented him from admitting to his mistakes. He had always subconsciously thought that Xu Shaoan would come and find him, thereby giving him a chance to explain himself. However, half a year had passed, and Xu Shaoan didn't come to visit him. The distance between the two of them also seemed to be constantly widening. If he didn't like her so much, then he wouldn't be in so much pain. But the fact of the matter was that he'd fallen hopelessly in love with her. However, the pride of the Holy Angel clan made him unwilling to apologize to her, and that was what pained him the most. Yue Hengyu sat on his seat with a blank expression. Perhaps he should find an opportunity to have a good chat with her during this trip. He reflexively turned toward Xu Shaoan, and much to his surprise, she was also looking at him. As soon as their eyes met, both of them reflexively looked away. However, right at this moment, an indescribable impulsive urge suddenly welled up in Yue Hengyu's heart, and he abruptly rose to his feet. He passed through the aisle and made his way over to the 3-person seat. She was sitting on the outside with Yuan and Yui sitting in the middle, and Xu Shaoan was seated on the innermost spot. Yue Hengyu said to Yuan and Yui, Yuanan, can I swap seats with you? I have something I need to say to Shaoan. Oi. Before Yuan and Yui had a chance to respond, Shi was already aiming a displeased glare at Yue Hengyu. However, he could only heave a resigned sigh in the end at the sight of the serious expressions on Yue Hengyu's face. Yuan and Yui didn't say anything, and she rose to her feet before taking a seat beside Tang Wuling. Shi also got up and stood in the aisle beside her, leaving the entire seat to Yue Hengyu and Xu Shaoan. Xu Shaoan glanced up at Yue Hengyu upon hearing his voice before immediately casting her gaze out the window. Chapter 789. Yue Hengyu made his way over to the seat before sitting down beside her. Shaoan. Xu Shaoan pretended not to have heard him. I'm sorry. If you're still angry about what happened during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention, then I'll apologize to you again. I was too rash and arrogant at the time, and for that, I am sorry. During these past 6 months, I thought about many things, and I realized just how important you are to me. I'm willing to lay down my pride, so can we? All of a sudden, Xu Shaoan turned around with a cold look in her eyes, and interjected, are you taking pity on me? I don't need your pity, nor any pity from your high and mighty Holy Angel clan. Yue Hengyu, I saw what kind of person you are on that day. I always thought that I'd be really happy with you, but only on that day did I realize that in your eyes, I'm nothing. I'm just a woman that you can summon and send away as you please, just like a servant. You're very exceptional. You come from a wealthy family, and you're very powerful, but I don't care about all that a single bit. Why are you apologizing to me? If you truly realized that you'd done something wrong, then you wouldn't have come to find me only after half a year had already passed. You can't set aside your pride. That's simply impossible for you. In your heart, you're always superior to everyone else. I won't ever consider entering a relationship with a man who's never seen me as an equal, so it's over between us. Xu Shaoan's voice was clearly quite emotional, and even the passengers around them couldn't help but turn around to appraise the situation that was unfolding. Yue Hengyu was starting to get angry now. What do you want me to do? I've already apologized to you, and who says I've never seen you as an equal? I love you with all my heart, and Xu Shaoan raised her hand in a cold manner to cut him off. I told you that it's over between us. Please get away from me. You're making me uncomfortable by sitting here. Yue Hengyu's chest was rising and falling violently as a furious look appeared on his face. He didn't think that Xu Shaoan would reject him in such a cold manner. It had been very difficult for him to muster up the resolve to apologize, but Xu Shaoan had stomped all over his apology. Xu Shaoan, I know that you're only rejecting me because of self-pity. You just feel inferior, right? Why can't you directly address the problems between us? Yes, I didn't come to find you during the past 6 months, but that was because I've been trying to sort out my own emotions this entire time. You're right. I really value my pride. After you rejected me in front of all of those people on that day, I was extremely angry and hurt, but after all this time, I've thought through everything, and I've realized that love is more important than my pride. I've already apologized to you, so what else do you want from me? Xu Shaoan harumphed coldly. I don't need your charity. Also, I'm not feeling inferior in any way. Don't forget that I'm one of Shrek's 7 monsters, so what do I have to feel self-pity about? Go away. Yue Hengyu abruptly rose to his feet. You better not regret this. Xu Shaoan turned away in a stubborn manner and refused to look at him. Yue Hengyu strode back to his own seat in an enraged manner, where both Shishi and Yuan and Yui were listening to their conversation with furrowed brows. Can't you be more gentle and calm? Shishi asked in a resigned manner. You need to be delicate with girls. Yue Hengyu roared. What do you care? You're right. No one cares about you. Yuan and Yui stood up and dragged Shishi back to their original seat before consoling Xu Shaoan, who had tears swimming in her eyes. Yue Hengyu sat back down beside Tang Wuling, and he was practically fuming with rage. He felt as if there were a massive rock weighing down on his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. Shishi wasn't enraged by Yue Hengyu's volatile reaction to his concern. Instead, he was feeling rather sympathetic toward Yue Hengyu. Xu Shaoan was right. Yue Hengyu was too proud, and that pride was something that had been drilled into the core of his being during all of the time that he'd spent in the Holy Angel clan. As such, this was not something that he could just discard at will. It was undoubtedly true that he liked Xu Shaoan, but it was also true that his confession during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention had dealt Xu Shaoan a very heavy blow. If he could have immediately realized what he'd done wrong and apologized to Xu Shaoan right away, then perhaps he still had a chance. However, he didn't do that. His pride had blinded him from what was truly important, and he'd ignored Xu Shaoan for half a year. Xu Shaoan perhaps wasn't as prideful as him, but she was a girl. How could she not be angry after being shunned for half a year? The best course of action that Yue Hengyu could take right now was to use persistent gentle persuasion and consolation to douse the flames of Xu Shaoan's fury. After all, he had to give her a chance to vent her rage. However, Yue Hengyu was also on the verge of erupting into a furious fit, so this situation was inevitable, and it only worked to further exacerbate their conflict. No one else could do anything about this, and external persuasion would only worsen the situation. Tang Wuling was truly very exhausted, so he was still sleeping very soundly despite Yue Hengyu and Xu Shaoan's loud verbal altercation. Yue Hengyu glanced at Tang Wuling, and he suddenly felt as if they were comrades in the same trench. Gu Yue had left without any explanation, as had Naya, and their departures would have undoubtedly been extremely painful for Tang Wuling to bear. Meanwhile, his situation wasn't much better than Tang Wuling's. The high-speed train traveled in a fast fast and stable manner. They were going to the northeastern coast of the Douluo continent, which was extremely far away, so even on this high-speed train, it would take them 3 days to get to their destination. Soon, the first day passed, and night gradually began to set in. Xu Xiaoan and Yue Zhengyu were both in very foul moods, so neither of them ate anything for the entire day. No one could do anything about this. They had both been blinded by fury, and simply wouldn't listen to reason. Tang Wulin had already distributed the money he'd received from Yu Chen among everyone, and all long-distance trains had dining carriages, so everyone else had already eaten. After dinner, Xu Lizzie turned to Yu Zinglan with a concerned expression, and asked, Sister Zinglan, should we wake boss up? He's been sleeping for an entire day already. The seats on long-distance trains were far wider than those on normal trains, and after being set in recline mode, one could virtually lie down on it, so it was definitely very comfortable to sleep on. Yu Zinglan shook her head, and replied, let him sleep. He must be exhausted both physically and mentally. He's been pushing himself way too hard ever since Du Yue left, so he needs this rest. Among all of us, he's the one that needs to relax the most. Xu Lizzie's brows furrowed as he sighed. I really don't understand why Du Yue had to leave. Boss is such a good person, why can't they just talk through their issues? Even if she's closely related to the Spirit Pagoda, it's not like we have any conflict against them. Yu Zinglan shook her head in response. I don't know the reasons behind this, but it's most likely not that simple. During the few years that Captain disappeared, Du Yue became a lot more quiet, and she's always away from the academy unless she's attending her classes. I could tell that she was even intentionally distancing herself from us. I'm not even sure Captain himself knows exactly why she did this. In any case, we should let him rest. There are no insurmountable hurdles in life, and they'll overcome their problems sooner or later. Just as they were speaking, the Soul train suddenly shuddered violently. Everyone folded momentarily, and in the next instant, the entire train suddenly veered off to the side. The sharp screeching sound of metal grating on metal rang out amid horrified screams that instantly filled the entire carriage. It was as if the high-speed train had been picked up before being hurled away. At the speed that the train was moving at, this sudden turn of events almost instantly disassembled the 16-carriage train. What's going on? Everyone was quite startled by this sudden development. Even though all of Shrek's 7 monsters were extremely powerful, they were still caught off guard and almost immediately thrown off their seats. Chapter 790. Scenarios like this were where Assault System Battle Soul Masters really shone. Specks of starlight began to emerge from Yu Zinglan's body, and a dazzling sword projection erupted forth as she instantly combined her body as one with her sword. She held onto Xu Lizzie with one hand, and even as the entire carriage tumbled and rolled, her body remained completely still as she hovered ever so slightly just above the ground. The rotating carriage was instantly sliced apart by the sword projection that she'd unleashed, and she rose up into the air with Xu Lizzie in tow. Everyone else also instantly reacted. Yue Zhengyu spread open his wings, and as soon as he was thrown out of his seat, his wings had already formed a barrier to protect him. At the same time, holy light erupted from his body, forming an additional barrier of light to protect him. Meanwhile, Yuan and Yui's body abruptly swelled in size, and she transformed into a titan giant ape while holding Xi and Xu Xiaoan in her 2 arms, using her massive ape body to shield them. Her massive body was crashing around within the carriage until Yu Zinglan sliced the carriage apart, upon which she was instantly catapulted outward. The most unfortunate one among them was Tang Wulin. He was still in a deep sleep, and was completely defenseless. Even when the train had trembled for the first time, he still didn't wake up. After the train began to swerve, Tang Wulin was hurled out of his seat, crashing heavily into the opposite wall, and only then did he open his eyes, just in time to see all of his friends catapulting out of the carriage. Tang Wulin's body tumbled around uncontrollably within the carriage, and he was still a little bleary-eyed as he quickly reached out, grabbing onto the wall with his hands. Golden scales appeared all over his body, and he shook his head vigorously to try and make himself more conscious and alert. After that, he tore through the wall of the train with his bare hands, and he was also thrown out of the carriage as a result. After being flung into the air, he was finally able to ascertain the current situation. The entire Soul train had been thrown off the rails and hurled into the air. The carriages split apart in midair before being flung away in all directions. What was even more concerning was that many people were thrown out of the cracks in the carriages by the momentum. These normal people were not Soul Masters, and they didn't have reactions like Tang Wulin and the others. As such, almost all of them perished as soon as they were flung out of the carriages. Tang Wulin was completely speechless. Why? Why does this happen every time? How is it possible that he always encountered these strange situations when taking high-speed trains? Did all of the train accidents in the history of the Federation have something to do with him? He was like the guaranteed ill omen of all Soul trains. Tang Wulin curled up into a ball in midair, and right before he was about to land on the ground, he threw an almighty punch into the ground, using the immense force generated to nullify his original momentum, thereby allowing him to roll onto the ground in a relatively smooth landing. With his body's insane defensive abilities, he certainly hadn't been injured during that ordeal, but it was most definitely not a good feeling to be jerked awake from a deep slumber. However, he didn't have time to delve on that now as he immediately began to search for his companions. Thankfully, everyone was very noticeable, especially Yu Zinglan, who had specks of starlight emanating from her body. Tang Wulin hurriedly raced over toward his friends. He had to ascertain that all of them were safe first. Of course, none of Shrek's 7 monsters were injured during that ordeal, and Tang Wulin was the last one to join them. All 7 of them glanced at one another before focusing their eyes on Tang Wulin for further instructions. Tang Wulin cleared his throat and said, let's save all of the people that we can. Hold on. Yu Zinglan suddenly said, this is way too strange. High-speed trains are generally extremely safe. How is this one suddenly thrown off the rails? Could it be that someone intentionally caused all of this to happen? At this moment, the entire Soul train had been completely derailed and landed in the nearby wilderness. The 16 carriages had been shattered in pieces, and howls of anguish rang out from all directions. A Soul train could house over 500 people, so such a major accident most definitely would have resulted in a high number of casualties. Tang Wulin also became more alert upon hearing Yu Zinglan's theory, and a grim look appeared on his face as he said, everyone, withdraw your martial souls for now. He had once faced off against evil Soul Masters, and that had been far from a pleasant experience. If this derailing weren't an accident and had been manufactured by someone, then it was certainly not as simple as it had been at first glance. Right at this moment, a light suddenly appeared in the distance. It wasn't very bright, but it seemed to be purple. Shishi whispered, I'll go have a look. All you should hide for now. His body swayed as he spoke, and he quickly turned transparent, vanishing into thin air in the blink of an eye. It's the role of an agility attack system battle Soul Master to take on the surveillance and investigation duties. Tang Wulin made a hand signal, and everyone quickly scrambled for cover to conceal themselves in the nearby area. It was important to save victims of the incident, but if there were enemies nearby, then eradicating those enemies had to be their top priority. Shishi was back after less than a minute. The incident was manufactured. There are people slaughtering injured victims. I counted roughly 50 to 60 of them, and they're all killing people on site using soul lasers. What do we do, boss? Tang Wulin asked. Did you manage to ascertain their power levels? Shishi replied, I can confirm that they're all Soul Masters, but I was unable to determine their cultivation ranks. They were only using soul lasers, and none of them released their martial souls, but the speed at which they were moving indicates that they're no pushovers. Let's go and take them down. There was no other alternative in this situation. How could they just stand by idly and watch as these terrorists wreaked havoc? Tang Wulin quickly rushed out, and everyone followed along behind him. To his left and right sides were Yu Zinglan and Yuan and Yui respectively, and they were followed by Xu Xiaoan and Xu Lizzie with Yue Zhengyu bringing up the rear. Xu Lizzie chanted a few incantations, quickly producing one steamed bun after another that he quickly distributed to his friends. There were agility mini soup buns that could enhance everyone's speed, and bloodthirsty red bean bun that were kept in reserve for moments when explosive power output was required. Soon, Tang Wulin caught sight of the enemies that Shishi had just been referring to. All of them wore black clothes and stalked their victims like ghosts in the night. A series of purple lasers shot forth from their soul laser guns and into the shattered carriages. All of these people in black were wearing helmets that obscured their faces, and someone immediately discovered Tang Wulin and his friends as they rushed toward the terrorists. The 5 men in black who were closest to them immediately immediately turned their guns around and began to shoot their soul lasers at Tang Wuling's group. Tang Wulin stepped forward, and golden scales appeared all over his body. At the same time, blue-silver emperor vines erupted forth, forming a barrier before him. The soul lasers exploded upon making contact with the barrier of vines, but the blue-silver emperor remained completely unscathed. Tang Wulin stomped a foot onto the ground, and his body shot forth like a cannonball. Even while he was still in midair, he made a grabbing motion, and two bursts of enormous suction force erupted from his hands, acting as a pair of vortexes that dragged two of the men in black toward him. He then summoned his golden dragon claws before lashing out at the two men. The two of them reacted extremely quickly, releasing their martial souls in an instant. One of them had 3 yellow soul rings, while the other had 1 white and 2 yellow soul rings. They were both soul elders. The man on the left possessed a beast martial soul, and as soon as he unleashed it, his body became more muscle-bound while a pair of cow horns appeared on his head. He used the suction force from Tang Wuling's golden dragon claws to his advantage and charged forward at an even faster speed. The other man in black had a martial soul that was a massive saber. He tossed aside the laser gun in his hand without any hesitation before swinging his saber toward Tang Wuling with all his might. Bam! Tang Wulin sent the Soul Master with the Beast Martial Soul flying with a swat from his left golden dragon claw, and the man's body was completely dismembered by his devastating power. Meanwhile, his right golden dragon claw gripped onto the oncoming saber, and the latter was instantly shattered. A Soul Master's martial soul was linked directly to them, so the destruction of the saber instantly made the Soul Master let loose an agonized groan. Tang Wulin then clenched his right golden dragon claw into a fist and rammed it straight into the man's chest, blasting him away like a cannonball. That man also suffered the same fate as his companion, with his body being dismembered by the almighty blow amid an explosion of blood mist. Tang Wulin absolutely abhorred these terrorists, so he wasn't holding back at all. After taking care of those two in the blink of an eye, he immediately charged toward the rest of the men in black in the distance. Meanwhile, Yuan and Yui and Yi Zinglan had also sprung into action. Yi Zinglan unleashed one sword projection after another with her Star God sword, and specks of starlight hurtled through the air. These men in black were only soul elders, so there was no way they could withstand her attacks. Her onslaught wasn't as violent as Tang Wulin's, but was just as effective. The martial soul that Yuan and Yui had chosen to unleash was her fallen angel. Compared to her titan giant ape martial soul, this one was more suitable for battle in the night. Her sword of darkness unleashed one streak of purple light after another, and she also took care of her enemies extremely quickly. The 4 people behind them didn't even get a chance to attack as Tang Wulin, Yi Zinglan, and Yuan and Yui were far too fast. In what seemed like an instant, 5 or 6 men in black had been slain. Thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Also leave a comment down below with suggestions on what novels to read.